We'll get a little song in later, Jane. So I'm gonna present some information. If you have any questions while I'm presenting, like Jan said, it is a conversation. I might not have all the answers, but if I don't, I'll find someone who does. Or I can find out for you at a later time. I want to talk a little bit about the big picture wilderness. I want to talk, before I get into that though, I want to talk a little bit about Grand Canyon and its significance and how those go hand in hand, at least from my perspective. As Jan mentioned, I've been at Grand Canyon for, actually it's closer to 23 years, and just ran into some folks that I knew before my Park Service career from West Cliff, Colorado, so it's kind of cool to see you guys here. So you're going to sing and join the choir too, I'm sure. So Grand Canyon legislation, long history, very important pieces of legislation, all the way back to, someone's waving at me in the booth. You know, when Teddy Roosevelt created this great place, just, you know, under a proclamation, just kind of recognizing why it's so important, why it's so important for the American public to enjoy it. The National Park Service Organic Act kind of set the stage for future designations. A few years after that was passed, Grand Canyon became an official national park, and I think if you were to look at the language of the Organic Act and look at the Wilderness Act, which was passed a little less than 50 years after that, you'll see that there's a lot of the same concepts repeated in that particular act. Some of the features, I know that a lot of you have been to these conversations before and have heard from park specialists, and many of you are experts yourself. I mentioned that first piece of legislation, and that's what it was about, was the greatest eroded canyon in the United States. And of course, it has Grand Canyon's great biological diversity. I have lots of numbers to tell you about how many species of animals and plants and things like that, but I'm afraid that since, you know, if I say something wrong, all these guys will pick on me. And then, of course, the rich, you know, human history. You heard from Ellen last year, you heard from Jan and Janet not too long ago about the prehistory and some of the history of Grand Canyon National Park, and of course it's visited by everyone from all over the world, up to 4.5 million visitors well, for a lot of reasons, but has just a spectacular wilderness setting, landscape, unmatched. And it also has, as many of you know, it plays a pivotal role in precedent-setting conservation issues. And many of you are familiar with those, and we'll see a little bit about that towards the end of the presentation. Really just the purpose of this slide is to kind of get through the jitters myself a little bit here. But also just to, kind of set the stage for, in the early part of the century, there was a lot going on that really helped, inform the wilderness movement eventually. Oh, that's not supposed to happen. So some of the key events in American history, first part of the 20th century, there was a big movement with establishing and designating national parks and national forests. There was also war, and there was a lot of demand on natural resources and other types of resources from these natural areas. And also the recession and Roosevelt's New Deal was also kind of a, played a pivotal role because, even though the parks were for the American public, they were also being loved to death. And then when we went into the recession, we didn't see as much visitation, but we saw different uses of the parks. We saw sort of the commercialization starting. The jobs really helped to address some of the issues associated with the Depression, but they also left the parks in a very different state. There were new roads, there were new buildings, there were hardened trails. It's a really nice, rich history, and there's a new book out on that too. But it really did sort of change the complexion of the Park Service at that time. And then, following the war, there was, sort of that industrialism and urbanization, people moving out to the cities and, these tract housing and things like that. So there was a lot of people starting to live in high-density areas, but at the same time, there was maybe a greater need for them to use the wilderness.
Dinah, you're on.
See the USA in your Chevrolet. America's asking you to call. Drive your Chevrolet through the USA. America's the greatest land of all. On a highway or a road along a levee. Performance is sweeter, nothing can beat it. Life is completer in a Chevy. So make a date today to see the USA. See it in your Chevrolet. Traveling east, traveling west.
For Americans, the automobile is the symbol of freedom and progress. We built more cars and roads than anyone else. The cars and roads took people to see the country, but they also changed the country. The roads made the wilderness accessible to tourists, and loggers, and miners, and builders. For America, this was progress. The American wilderness, progress meant destruction.
That's a clip from a film called Wild by Law. So it took, a couple of very passionate people to get the wilderness movement started. You're probably familiar with some of these characters up here. You can't talk about the Yosemite without thinking of John Muir. He was also very instrumental in getting a lot of the national parks in the early days established. He had close relations with our presidents back then. He took them into the wilderness and convinced them that they needed to set these places aside for our enjoyment and for our children's enjoyment. This fellow, Aldo Leopold, had a very different approach. He was a scholar, but at the early, his first career was actually as a forest ranger. And he worked in what is now the Gila Wilderness, Aldo Leopold Gila Wilderness. And he believed in hunting and fishing, and he felt like that's what the forests were for. So in his early career, that's what he did. He made sure that there were lots of deer in the forest. And there were also lots of wolves at that time. And he thought, boy, these wolves are preying on my deer, so we need to deal with that. So he was hunting deer. I'm sorry, he was hunting wolf. And one day he just kind of changed his life when he killed a wolf. And he looked into its eyes when he approached it, and he saw that green fire. And he eventually changed his mind, kind of changed his thinking. He thought that wilderness really is a place that needs to, might be a place where you know, man just does nothing there, and that's okay. The other fellow, Bob Marshall, he was a millionaire, and he was from the East Coast. He spent about 90% of his life in the wilds, hiking, exploring, but he was very, very passionate. He used his fortunes to actually buy large tracts of forested lands in the eastern part of the United States to prevent logging and mining and things like that. And he actually, you can see he only lived for 39 years. He was the founder of the Wilderness Society. And he was actually on his way from New York to Washington, D.C. for the second sort of annual wilderness convention, and he died of a heart attack while riding a train. This is a guy who hiked 70 miles a day, just like Don Lago. Howard Sonnheiser was, he was an unlikely hero of the wilderness movement. He was a minister's son. He was a career civil servant, a government employee. He quit his job around at the age of 46, and he decided to work for the Wilderness Society. His first effort was trying to save Dinosaur National Monument by opposing and preventing the construction of Echo Park Dam. He joined forces with David Brower, you're familiar with that story, and together they successfully convinced Congress to change their votes. There was a lot of support early on for that dam. He personally hounded, he was called a bureaucratic pit bull. He hounded over 100 congressmen and convinced them to change their votes. And they did. So after that victory, he recognized that, you know, it's going to take an act of Congress to get permanent protection for these areas. So that's when he went to work. He was still working for the Wilderness Society. He started that work. He's pretty much the premier author of that. You know, through his work at Dinosaur National Monument, he got to know, good or bad, a lot of congressmen. It took him about 8 years to write this law. It took 66 rewrites, and he attended about 20 congressional hearings personally over those years. The law was signed into act by LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, and it was signed 4 months after Sonnheiser's death. So what about this thing called wilderness? If you think of it, everyone sort of probably has that personal feeling about what it was. But first we're going to take a look at, you know, sort of that legal definition. We got, you know, he spent 8 years on it. We've got to give it some airtime here. So, and maybe after you look at some of this, you'll understand why it took 8 years. So we're just going to explore just a little bit of the act, mostly focusing on the definition and then what uses were intended in there. So some very eloquent language here, at least I think so, since I'm the choir leader here. Very specific. A wilderness, in contrast with those areas where man and his works dominate the landscape, is an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, and where man himself is a visitor who does not remain.